And thank you, Henry. We were going to do that, so we got it. All right. And then any next steps, or like I say, answering questions. So next slide. So as recycling professionals working with the public, you know, Preston and I often deal with some of these issues. Maybe you do too in your organizations. So maybe you have confused residents who complain about what is accepted in places like Seattle and not in your program, which I hear a lot in Spokane. It's like, why can't we recycle cartons in Spokane? They do it in Portland and Seattle. Or you've got residents that are a little disillusioned about the recycling system because they read a New York Times article or watched a documentary that said everything they're putting their blue carts ending up in the garbage or incinerator anyway, so why don't we just throw it away? Or you've been working in this profession for years, and no matter how hard you work to educate people, how much money you spend on those programs, it seems like our diversion rates are going down and we still have a lot of this material in our waste stream. Or you've got residents claiming that you don't care about the planet because you just removed plastics 3s through 7s from your recycling cart. And so you're a bad, uncaring, unfeeling government, which I got recently too. So a lot of reasons why we want to address this issue. So next slide. And it can get complicated. So this is a slide that looks at our current recycling system. And it is a bit complex, and I'm not going to test you on this. I'm not even going to expect you to read all of the small print in all of those circles, but it does give you an idea of how many factors are at play in what we can recycle, how much, what, and where that material goes and its value and all of that. And what is interesting is that it's made up of things that you can control and things that you have no control over. And unfortunately, it seems like there are a lot more things that you don't have control over than what you do have control. So next slide. And for packaging, it's the system that we have now puts a lot of that burden on the consumer. So right now, the expectation is that a resident will purchase a product that will have packaging, whether it's paper or plastic. They're paying for that product, and then after they consume the product, they have to do something with that packaging. Throw it in a recycle bin or a trash bin or a compost bin. But they're also paying for that service. So they are paying at kind of at both ends of what to do with that material. So next slide. And what we are finding from studies is that, is the system really working? So how many people in this call have spent, countless hours educating their residents on how to properly recycle and what's accepted? And all of that effort is not in vain, because Washington State does have one of the best recycling diversion rates in all of the country. So good job, pat yourselves on the back. But over the last few years, those diversion rates are stagnating or even dropping. And so the most current information we have from the Department of Ecology, their 2017 study, shows that we've dropped below that 50%. As a state, we're at 48.5%. So everything that we're doing, is it enough right now? Next slide. And think about lost opportunity. So our most recent waste characterization study, also done by Department of Ecology, and this, again, granted, this took place last year during the COVID year. There are a lot of issues, with the statistics maybe based on that, but it's still very telling information that when you look at what still is in our waste stream after we recycle, what we can, we're still looking at materials over 16% paper and 13% plastic. And what that amounts to volume-wise is 1.5 million tons worth of plastic and paper are still ending up in a landfill, or in Spokane, we have a waste energy plant or an incinerator. And, you look at 1.5 million tons, you think of the weight, because this is weight-based, and how light paper and plastic really is. So when you look at volume, I mean, you're looking at a much larger amount. Okay, next. And then some things that we're seeing today are that residents are being asked to absorb the rising costs of recycling in this market volatility. So in UTC regulated areas, the rates for recycling services have increased 36% in the past 5 years. And for ratepayers, it doesn't matter how good of a recycler they are. I mean, their rates don't go down. So they could be doing everything right, putting everything in, but the rates are kind of independent of their behaviors. They just kind of keep going up. And in municipalities like City of Spokane, with our collection service, our recycling fees are invisible to ratepayers because they are embedded in our garbage fees. And so ratepayers may not see this. And that leaves challenges for us as a government on, how do we make our ratepayers understand the importance of their behaviors in recycling. And just for an example, in 2020, the city, we lost $1.5 million in our recycling programs due to low markets and climbing costs of processing. So next slide. So how are local governments reacting? I mean, what are our options? So we can reduce what we collect in our blue carts, like King County, they've had to remove items. Like Tacoma, they implement surcharges. So different cities, Tacoma, anywhere from $2 to $3 to $4 a month surcharge to every customer to help cover that deficit in their caused by the recycling costs. In the City of Spokane this past year, we didn't choose to do a surcharge, but we did go to every other week service. And that caused a little bit of heartburn too, but it did help make up, or it will make up that, like say, $1.5 million. Or like Franklin County, they've stopped curbside recycle pickup. They've gone to just drop boxes. So next slide. And when you look at equity of access to recycling or curbside recycling in Washington State, it's not equal access to everybody. Only about 58% of residential households have curbside recycling in Washington State. And there is no curbside recycling at all in 11 of the Washington's 39 counties. And this isn't the fault of any government or community, because a lot of places, especially in the eastern part of the state, is very rural. It doesn't economically make sense to send trucks around to pick up the material at curbside. And the cost and the carbon footprint of collecting it and transporting it to market, might outweigh the kind of benefit of it. But when you look at having customers who want to recycle, they want to do the right thing with the material, with the packaging they have, and they have very few options. What can we do to make it a little bit more of a level playing field throughout the state? Those are things that we're considering. So next slide. And then, what are residents saying? So there seems to be again, I mentioned this, a growing frustration among residents in Washington of, why do they keep selling us things that we can't recycle? Why does Amazon have this mailing pouch that says it's recyclable all over it, but I get in trouble if I put it in my blue cart where I live? Why, if the material is so hard to recycle, why do they keep producing us? And then why do we have to do all the work? And the people who produce the packaging don't have to do or pay anything for its disposal. So a lot of issues to kind of lay the framework for where we're at with recycling in Washington. And now I am going to turn it over to Preston to talk about how EPR can address these things.
Thanks, Kris. Much appreciated. Am I coming through all right on audio?
Sounds good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, yeah, and thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Kris, for that background and context. I'm sure given the audience on the call today, many of you are probably aware of a lot of this and face these challenges on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of the stuff Kris and I have had conversations about, what our residents are saying, what we're hearing, and I'm sure many of you across the state experience very similar kind of anecdotes or conversations with residents, which can kind of be a frustrating position to be in because there's limitations on what we can do, like Kris was talking about, so far as adjusting programs and stuff. So this is really an attempt to look at the system holistically. So we can walk through a few of our options that we can, given the context and the background on the situation, and we can look at things through kind of incremental change is one way to look at it as far as an option. So if you've ever played a game of Jenga, you know that you have kind of a finite number of blocks, and you can take blocks out, you can put them different places, you can keep building on those, but ultimately you will reach the end of the possibilities that you have with those blocks. So when I say something like incremental change, we've been doing a lot of that, and to be blunt, we're running out of blocks. And so that's one option that we can continue looking at, but I think that there's going to be limitations or diminishing returns on that. Another option that we talked about was removing problem items from curbside collection. Well, this is kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, right? They keep popping up without any kind of influence on the types of packaging that are being brought into the market and that consumers have access to or our residents have access to. It's going to be continuously trying to hit over here or hit over here and trying to remove this one. So there really needs to be a look at the system holistically and try to think about minimizing what's coming in so that we can really focus our efforts and maximize the efficiency in the program. And then, like anything, there's always the option of just kind of hoping and praying that things change. And I'm sure, given a lot of the previous policies around China sword and things like that, we've been doing a lot of hoping so far as trying to see if markets are going to come back and things. So maybe it's time to have a conversation about modernizing the recycling stream and modernizing the industry as a whole across Washington State. So some of you, I gave a presentation previously for Washington State Recycling Association and used this analogy. So apologies to those that may have heard it before. I think it's a good analogy, so I'm going to use it again. Hopefully it's entertaining. But when I say modernizing, what you're seeing on your screen is my 1969 Chevrolet C10 truck. It's a wonderful truck. I love this truck. I feel very close to this truck. It was my grandfather's, passed it down to my father who gave it to me. So it's only been in my family, and it's great so far as hauling things around town or getting me safely from point A to point B. A lot of different kind of functional pieces to it. It works. But that being said, I would love it if it got more than, say, 10 miles to the gallon, which is about what it gets, unfortunately. I'd also love it during that like hot 2 or 3 weeks we have in Washington, if it had some AC in it. Right now, it doesn't have AC. And then I love music. I love listening to music. I would love if it had something besides the fun AM original radio in there, maybe a Bluetooth connection, something like that, where I can listen to music as I drive. So there's a lot of things that I wish it had in it. And so what happened is not just me, but in general, Chevrolet, the company that made this, they recognize that too about their customers, right? They understand that they had something good in the C10 truck. It was functional, it sold well, it was good for the time. However, moving forward, they realize, hey, our customers probably want some AC in their truck. They want to have a CD player or Bluetooth connection in their truck. They want to get better gas mileage, those kinds of things. So what did they do? They modernized and built upon the knowledge and the good work that they did to build something to meet the needs of today. And so when I'm talking about EPR, I'm not saying that we have a bad recycling system. As Kris very well pointed out, we have a good recycling system, but it could be modernized to meet the needs of today and address the challenges that we face. So as Kris mentioned, this is a little 101 in EPR. So I thought it's always good to start with kind of definitions. So what is extended producer responsibility? Or EPR. EPR is at its base a law that mandates responsibilities to producers for the end of life management of their products, which we haven't really had outside of maybe some product stewardship programs, which we'll talk a little bit about later. And additionally, it can create through that law, there can be individual producer accountability through a collective entity, also known as a producer responsibility organization, or a PRO. And that is a collection of producers that work together to monitor their progress towards recycling rates that they're mandated in law, and also create accountability across the industry. At its core, EPR is a polluters pays model. So it's up to the producers who put the packaging and paper products out into the market to make sure that those products are responsibly disposed of or recycled in the process. And there's some fee structures within there that can help incentivize that for them. To continue that, EPR is a outcomes-based policy. It requires producers to fully fund recycling for all residents. So an EPR program, if it's to work correctly, would eliminate recycling fees for residents of Tacoma. It also requires that there's investments in infrastructure improvements, again, building on the good work we have done to modernize the system. Create and fund consistent education and outreach. I know many people on this call are probably educators out there, and boy, wouldn't we love it if we didn't have to say, well, in Tacoma, we accept this, but in Pierce County, they accept that. But actually in Pierce County and Tacoma have been working pretty closely to harmonize our systems on our own. So this would actually create it statewide, where there's consistent education and outreach to reduce confusion for residents, and therefore getting better recycling because there's not so much confusion jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It also requires producers to meet mandated recycling and reuse targets. I'll get into the specifics of those later on. And ensure responsible recycling. So thinking about verifiable end markets, which I know, especially in the wake of China sword and seeing these materials going to countries that did not have the capacity to deal with them, is very important, especially from an environmental justice standpoint. That we have, it's very important that we have these verifiable end markets for these products that are actually getting turned into new things too. And then it also requires that they are being made into new products, which I've had many conversations with people about, well, what happens to this and what happens to that? And, you know, a lot of folks who are on this call may be aware that it kind of stops at the MRF, or at least it does for me. If you have more information, love to know it. But it's hard to get a lot of that proprietary information from our MRFs and where these materials are going and what products they're being made into. So EPR as a concept and as a policy is nothing new. It actually, the first EPR policy started in Germany in the 90s. In the US, producer responsibility has generally been used for products outside of the residential recycling stream, but in places like Europe and Canada, they've been applying this to packaging and paper products for quite a while. And that's used to support residential recycling programs. Today, producer responsibility programs for packaging are being adopted at an accelerating rate. Many countries are preparing to implement their policies in the next 2 to 3 years. So what does this mean for multinational corporations that sell these products into Washington? It means they're already familiar with these programs. They understand, they've dealt with them before because their products are international products. They're sold on the international market. And they've had some pretty good results so far. When British Columbia implemented their EPR policy, they saw a 9% increase in access to recycling service and a 20% increase in recovery rate for packaging and paper products. But given that many people are probably familiar with that system, it's not perfect. So we're going to talk a little bit about what an EPR policy for Washington to meet Washington's needs will look like a little bit more in this presentation. Lastly, you'll probably notice that the US as a whole is gray on EPR policies, meaning that we don't have one. State by state, we're starting to see more states actually adopt policies. We've seen this in Oregon last session, seeing in Maine, New York, and then perhaps Washington in the future. So there is incremental change at the state level happening. And as you might recall, I mentioned earlier, talking a little bit about product stewardships and EPR programs in Washington State. We've actually had some of these programs in Washington and currently have some of these programs that are working quite well. You may be aware of the eCycle Washington program focused on electronics. This legislation passed in 2006 and was implemented in 2009. Light Recycle Washington passed in 2010, started in 2015. Take Back Your Meds program passed in 2017, started in 2020. And now we're seeing Paint Care rolling out now, that passed in 2019 and is starting to roll out this past year. So you may remember that slide that Kris talked about earlier that had kind of the customer or the resident in the center, and then the collection on one side, and then the actual product that they purchased on the other side. So that's kind of our current system right now. You see customers paying for a product, and then they are also paying for a product when they pay out their solid waste bills for collection and recycling. And there's not a lot of certainty on the end of life, on the end markets for those two. And that it varies somewhat depending on if you're a private hauler and a city or county contracts with them, or like Tacoma, that's a municipal hauler. So there's some nuances within that current system, but more or less, this is the current system. So with an EPR system, animation, here we come. You would have producers paying for that collection and recycling with government oversight and enforcement. I'll get into the specifics about that a little bit later. And one other thing, there would be a minimum recycled content mandate, which would require that producers use that recycled material and have verifiable end markets for that material being made into new products to help create that circular economy, where it's coming back to the producers, they are pushing it back out to the residents, and then they are helping to fund that collection and getting that material back. So you're really seeing that loop being complete. And when we think about areas of opportunity or areas where we could possibly act on our recycling system in the state of Washington, there's really four kind of broad key areas for action, more or less. And that's product design, public education, infrastructure investments, and end markets. Traditionally, we focused our effort on kind of the middle two, public education and infrastructure investments, but kind of like that game of Jenga, it's only going to take us so far. End markets were partially addressed last year through a few different products that some of you may be aware or maybe worked on, Senate Bill 5022, which helped to build that demand, but we need to develop clean supply through EPR too, to kind of close that loop. And we've left the supply design mostly up to the producers. So when we address those end markets and product design while continuing to support strong public education and infrastructure investments, then we can create a well-coordinated system that allows for clean, safe materials flowing in a truly circular economy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some goals and potential solutions for EPR in Washington. So really the big picture goals of EPR in Washington are that manufacturers, brands, finance a coordinated system that includes education, collection, recycling, and more. Also, another goal is to create a specific list of covered materials that would be defined in that policy. And the roles of all the players would be well defined. So state agency would have oversight and enforcement authority. Local governments, their role would be well defined. Private haulers' role would be well defined. And processors like MRFs, their role would be defined, among other kind of key stakeholders in this industry. And the fourth goal is a big goal. Performance standards are established. There's got to be accountability here too. So a proposed solution to that would be the RENEW Act, which Kris alluded to earlier about a potential piece of legislation coming up in Washington. So the RENEW Act right now is an outcomes-based policy. It's focused on increasing reuse and recycling in the state of Washington, trying to get us away from that stagnated 50% or so, and really trying to bump that up. Also attempting to address access issues and thinking about equitable access to recycling services across the state, which Kris highlighted earlier is just not happening right now for a variety of reasons. And thinking about that universal and convenient recycling services for all. And one way to help that is through creating a harmonized list of accepted materials, decreasing that confusion across the state. And then third, you've heard me talk a lot about end markets. So thinking about responsible recycling, that materials must be sent to verifiable end markets that meet certain environmental, labor, health, and safety standards. So really trying to avoid a lot of those environmental injustices that we saw in the aftermath of China National Sword. So what would the Renew Act do? First, it would require producers to join a nonprofit producer responsibility organization. So PRO, you might remember from earlier slide, to fully fund and coordinate the system. It would require universal residential recycling collection, harmonized list of materials, specific targets, outreach and education, and system improvement, so that infrastructure investment. Again, would have mandated targets for these producers on materials and how much to recycle over a given period of time, and clear and consistent labeling for recyclability. So you know the chasing arrows, and that's part of the discussion too, because we've recognized that that is a main point of confusion for residents across the state. It would also require post-consumer content for additional products, so polypropylene tubs, PET thermoforms, like clamshells, that kind of stuff, and single-use cups, those single-use items. A lot of that was kind of discussed in the aftermath of SB 5022 through a stakeholder committee, and so trying to use the information learned through that process to try to, again, create that consistent loop of materials. And there'd be several benefits for an EPR policy in the state of Washington, such as the Renew Act. Broadly, there would be economic benefits. So thinking about stable funding for recycling and investment for improvements. I know at our level in City of Tacoma, that consistent funding is always a challenge for us, given the volatility in recycling markets. I'm sure many of you have your own experience with that. And that our residents wouldn't have to pay for recycling anymore. That's been a very big point of contention. You know, wages have not necessarily grown at the same speed as some kind of service rate increases, things like that. So there's a lot of frustration amongst residents. Why do our rates and things keep going up, but my paycheck doesn't? Those kind of things. Only so much of that we can have control over, but I think that there would be a big support around removing the recycling payment aspect of it. There would also be social benefits, thinking about those accessibility, convenient, and free access for all residents in Washington. And through an act like the Renew Act, it could create around 1,600 new local green living wage jobs in the state of Washington. And then we're all in the recycling industry. I'm sure there's an environmental lens for most, if not all of us on this call. The environmental benefits would be that over 50% more materials would be recycled than today. So talking about over almost 300,000 tons, and then almost 2 million metric CO2 tons saved through this potential policy. There would be a lot of energy saved through this too. So thinking about greenhouse gases and kind of thinking about what that energy looks like. I think most of you on this call are probably pretty well versed in the recycling industry, but if you're not, and in case just for folks who may not be aware, this chart is looking at the energy savings for recycled products versus virgin material. So virgin material would be what these products are created out of, the actual elements and actual things in the natural environment that these things come from. So as you can see, there'd be pretty big energy savings from this. And I talked earlier about specific kind of rate or recycling and reuse rates. So this is what the Renew Act is proposing right now by 2030. Obviously, it's going through the legislative process, so this is going to be, you know, adjusted a little bit. I'm sure there will be more conversations about this, but really looking at all covered products. So thinking about rigid plastics, flexible plastics, paper, aluminum, steel, glass. All covered products would have a recycling and reuse rate of 75% by 2030. And that 10% reuse is of the 75% there, just for clarity and more understanding. So stay tuned, more to come about that. If you're interested, you definitely want to be involved and keep an eye on this because there will be negotiations through the legislative process. All in all, the outcome of the Renew Act is to really have all packaging and printed products be reusable, recyclable, or compostable no later than January 1st, 2030. So that's kind of the main takeaway from this act. And then there's the nuances of how it will work that are embedded within the act itself. So some of you may be wondering kind of like, how is all this going to work? I heard you talking about a pro and local governments and state oversight. So this is a really fun chart that we have that goes through and kind of attempts to outline this. So I can start with the right side of the slide. If you're looking at state oversight, that would be conducted by Department of Ecology. So thinking about rulemaking, registration of products, reviewing and approving plans and performance, and then compliance and enforcement authority as well. If you look on the kind of opposite side, on the left side, you see the pro that I talked about earlier. So producers would form a producer responsibility organization to help with the accountability for individual producers, but also efficiency in collecting data and reporting to ecology. And then in between, at the top in the center, you see the Renew Advisory Council. And they kind of go as an in-between between the state oversight and the producers and provide input into things like, just below them, you'll see the needs assessment and the pro plan. The needs assessment would come before implementation and really looks at the system as a whole and identifies what is needed actually to get the system to the point where it can reach the goals of the EPR policy as a whole. From the needs assessment, the producer responsibility organization, would submit a plan to the state oversight agency, Department of Ecology, for review, saying, we've done our needs assessment, we understand what needs to be done, here's our plan. And then ecology would look at that plan and then approve it or have some tweaks, things like that. Then the pro would actually implement that plan, and there would be annual reports going back to the Department of Ecology for review. How'd you do? What exemptions do you need? Things like that, and trying to make the system work both for residents, municipalities, as well as producers, and really trying to think about the system as a whole. So now I'm going back to local governments on your left side of the screen. The producers would fully fund the local governments to continue providing those services or maintain existing contracts and potentially conduct education and outreach. Should the local governments be contracting with a hauler, the producers would fund those service providers to continue their role as a hauler, or if they're a processor, or potentially, like some companies, both. Or local governments would pay them directly. That's that kind of middle line there. All the while, residents are continuing to receive a recycling service at no cost to them. So how would the funding piece of this work? All basic costs related to recycling and achieving the outcomes of the policy would be covered by the producers. This includes collection of recyclables, transportation, processing, marketing, reporting, education and outreach, and oversight from the administration, from ecology. The needs assessment would be conducted before the program starts to determine how local governments will be reimbursed. But they're looking at a couple different options right now, be it, and so that will come out more as the negotiation process continues. And the pro should be required to provide transparent contract terms to the to both the state for their reimbursement and then also the local jurisdiction as well. So this would create some universal, consistent recycling collection, and really it's on the producer responsibility organization to think about kind of statewide education and outreach to address contamination and resident confusion. So you might remember Ecology did a very strong campaign around recycling right that was statewide. Think of things like that, where it's consistent messaging statewide, trying to achieve a goal, reducing contamination. And as I mentioned, producers must compensate cities and counties that provide collection or outreach services for all reasonable costs associated with those services, which include the management and administrative costs too. So as different local jurisdictions on the call, you might be curious, like, how would authority work in this situation? Well, municipal haulers in cities and counties with contracts with service providers would continue providing those services to their residents and are reimbursed by producers for those reasonable costs. Existing UTC regulations and collection services franchise will remain in place, but the rates are paid by the producers, not the residents. And services would be aligned for statewide consistency and expanding to universal access. So thinking about increasing that access, especially in areas that don't have it right now. So essentially the producers pay for the service, fill the gaps to increase access, improve the recycling system through, say, infrastructure investments, and ensure that there are end markets for collected materials. So when could this happen? When would we be thinking this? Again, a lot of this is kind of a moving target as it's going through negotiation right now, but this wouldn't happen overnight. There would essentially be 5 years between the law being adopted and then the plan rollout, which would include time for producers to join the pro and register with Ecology, saying, hey, I'm part of this pro now. This is going to be where we're reporting. It also gives time for a needs assessment, which is probably going to be performed by a third-party consultant. Again, negotiations, so can't say that definitively right now. And the pro development of a plan to meet all those targets. So they would develop that pro plan that I talked about on the previous slide. And then we would have to create, there would have to be the creation of that Renew Act Advisory Council, which would review the plan and provide ongoing counsel to the program. That group, again, in negotiations, would be made up of representatives from local governments, private haulers, producers, environmental groups, small businesses, and members representing traditionally underserved or marginalized groups in the state. As local solid waste management plans expired, then they would get updated to align with the new plan in coordination with Ecology. So I just went through updating our Tacoma Pierce County solid waste management plan with Pierce County. And so not now, given that that plan is just being finalized right now, but when we go to redo it, then it would be drafted in the context of a new system and be in alignment with Department of Ecology. So you might be wondering, what can I do immediately and both in the long term? Immediately, I think it's important to continue reading information about this. I myself am still learning about EPR policies, both within the US and looking at different legislation that have been introduced or passed in other states, as well as internationally as well. And continue to understand what it is. And I think equally as important, what it is not. There can be a lot of misleading information that's just not accurate out there about it. So I think it's important to really understand what it is, especially if you're having internal conversations with people. And I would say educate your peers on what it is and your colleagues as well. And then long term, I think it's important as municipal or county jurisdictions or even statewide, it's important to follow the legislative process and understand how anything being discussed at the state level would impact your organization. And it's important to keep not only yourself, but others informed about EPR policies and how they may impact you. Look for opportunities to address ongoing recycling, reuse, and waste prevention through EPR policies, which can be one lever to get to the goals of these kind of big picture actions. And then consider integrating EPR principles into county solid waste management plans or other organizational plans as well, when it seems appropriate. And with that, I think we got a few minutes for questions. Left a great picture of Kris in front of a giant tortoise. And there's my father and I about to go hunting in front of the aforementioned truck. So just some fun photos to wrap us up today. But yeah, I think we're good to take questions now. I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, and we didn't really go over the process of doing that, but I would certainly, I think we have a size group that if you'd like to raise your hand, we can call on you and you could unmute and ask the question. Or if you feel more comfortable typing it into the chat box, we can certainly address it that way. And like say, Preston and I, if it's something that we can't answer, we've got a lot of smart people on this call, and we can certainly call on them to help us.
Absolutely. So ask your question. No question is too small.
So Henry had a question like listserv. So Henry, are you thinking that we should create a listserv if anybody interested in following the progression of the Renew Act?
Please. That's what
All right.
Henry says. So yeah, Henry, one other thing that I would tell you is an option too. I also serve on the Washington State Recycling Association Board of Directors and am co-chair of their policy committee. And so if you're interested in following kind of legislative bills, including the Renew Act, but others, you're welcome to join those meetings as well. We go through and have lots of good people, especially during session, kind of reviewing bills where they're at and have discussions about impact. So I can drop my email into the chat and feel free to follow up with me via email, and I'm happy to include you.
Awesome. And then Erin can't raise her hand, but if you'd like to unmute Erin and go ahead and ask your question, that'd be great.
Thank you so much. So my quick question, I think this all sounds wonderful, and thank you both so much for presenting and just kind of helping me wade through it a few more times. I think the more I hear it, the more I understand it all. But I'm wondering if you have any recommendations from the city perspective for our legislative policy team. You know, I'm trying to get these various Washington solid waste bills on their radar as well. And I'm just wondering, I hear a lot of the positives and the benefits, especially from an outreach ear, but I'm wondering, you know, are there changes that we foresee, you know, or things we should be advocating for now while it is still kind of in limbo and language is changing? I'm wondering if there's things from a city perspective we don't necessarily like or we are afraid will happen that we can be advocating for now from our policy side.
Kris, I can jump in and give my perspective and then feel free. Thanks for the question. Very good question, Erin. I think, again, we're a little bit unique. It looks like you're from Bellevue. In Tacoma, we're a municipal hauler, and so we collect our own and own our own fleet of trucks and so forth. And so one thing that I've been really focused on is the reimbursement model for cities to make sure that our collections are covered, our administrative side's covered, our education and outreach is covered, because the residents of Tacoma really value the different services that we have. And I understand that producers, especially big multinational corporations, they're really focused on making sure that they're hitting the right profit margins, which I completely understand. However, that doesn't necessarily translate to the way that we do business in City of Tacoma. And so I've been really focused on making sure that the policy encapsulates that ability to reimburse for full cost. And then in addition to that, I've also been working with our government relations department as well to make sure that they're aware that I'm aware of this bill and that they're aware of this bill. And we've had discussions about integrating that into our legislative agenda. So previously, a couple months ago, they went before council to adopt our legislative agenda for next session. And there's specific language in there that supports extended producer responsibility legislation and product stewardship program legislation that's broad enough where we can, you know, look out for the best interest for solid waste at City of Tacoma, but also have a specific directive coming from our council and our government affairs office saying that we as a city and organization support this kind of work.
And I say it's the same with City of Spokane. We have a sustainability office through our city council. It's our city council that has a lobbyist on staff. And so it's just being very clear with the city council representative and that lobbyist of what are the things, important things that we want to make sure are included in any legislation, that it's not edited out or replaced, or if there's competing legislation that might be in opposition to kind of the bill that we would like to see passed. So it's kind of making, it's keeping track of all this and then making sure that they know what our feelings are. So there's a lot of effort in following that through.
Thank you both.
No problem. Adrian, I see you're on, you know, I wanted to give you an opportunity too, if there's anything specific for King County that you feel is pertinent. I just wanted you to be able to jump in here.
Thanks. Nothing to add for now. I mean, we were trying to the extent possible to make sure that local governments maintain their authority, but there will be, the whole idea is to harmonize a kind of like what's considered acceptable for recycling and expand access to recycling. So there is some kind of harmonization that has to go on, but cities still maintain their own contracts, or like Tacoma does, that will continue.
Which I think touches on a little bit of, Henry has a question like, what could be the impact to privately owned MRFs of this legislation?
Yeah, Henry, if you have the ability to come and unmute yourself and kind of get a little bit more specific with the question, I think that would be helpful maybe for us, so that we're not just kind of speaking broadly.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
So in thinking about, so having producers take over the responsibility of the system in some places, and I think it's British Columbia, don't they also run the MRFs? And so if like in this area, we have a privately held MRF, if EPR became statewide and the producers became in charge of it, are they going to want to be in charge of the MRF, for instance, to have that level of control? And because the MRF here is privately owned, will there be some kind of conflict?
It's a good question, Henry. Adrian, I saw you come off mute. Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, in the short term, well, first of all, in British Columbia, the producer responsibility organization contracts for services. They don't do any of the collection or the processing themselves. So I believe it's GFL that does it. That's the MRF up there. So in the short term, I don't think there's going to be much impact to the privately owned MRFs because the contracts will run. Over time, what we might see is a more coordinated approach to how you deal with recycling. So one of the things, instead of each little jurisdiction and each service provider trying to optimize the system within what they do, you might see materials being gathered in certain MRF sheds. And in that way, you could see economies of scale and more materials getting processed, and maybe a greater coordination of how that works out. Because currently we have a kind of like patchwork system of MRFs. In the short term, I don't expect anything, but slowly, while working together with the waste management industry, hopefully we'll have something that becomes more efficient over time. The Pro also supplies upgrades and investments in processing. So that will also benefit a lot of the privately owned MRFs. And in general, because we have to increase the recycling rates, about 30%, what we've seen is this, the amount of activity or materials that have to be processed goes up. So in general, all the haulers and all the MRFs would have plenty of work to do in order to fulfill the requirements.
Thank you.
And I know you had a follow-up question about markets, but let's go to Diana. She's got her hand up, and then maybe we can talk about markets if we have time after that.
Thanks, Kris. Diana Wadley, Ecology. I was just curious about the stated goal of making, and maybe it's just a bit broad, but talking about making every package reusable, recyclable, or compostable. And I just wonder if a better goal might be to look at, does it actually conserve resources and reduce pollution? And tying that into, Kris, you mentioned, out in the rural areas, sometimes it just might make sense to have drop boxes rather than a big truck bumbling around picking up a small amount of materials. And then also I'm tying it in specifically to the two slides and wondering, there's probably more explanation, so I am getting to a question here, about the slides about energy saved, recycled versus virgin materials. We see aluminum at the top, glass at the bottom. But then the next slide was the targets for covered products by 2030 for recycling and reuse rates, where aluminum was at 75% and glass was ranked higher. The target was higher at 85%. So I'm just wondering some of the thought processes behind the goal, and then also those two slides.
Yeah, so I can start with the first. So there's kind of two questions here is what I'm hearing. The first question has to do with the focus of the policy as it stands is really focused on more of recycling than thinking about kind of product management from a greenhouse gas perspective. Is that right? Did I capture that right?
Essentially, and resource use in general.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that that's a very fair, good point as well. And I think that a lot of it is it's very contingent upon what product you're talking about, but it's very subjective in the sense of how far does it have to get to market? How far is it going after it's purchased? What is that end use looking like? You know, and where does it have to go for? There's a lot of variables within that. So it's hard to say that this specific product, it's better to be thrown away without knowing all of the other variables at play, right? And so I think what this is doing is taking a first step at a waste reduction strategy through actually recycling our materials. Ultimately, you know, I think many people on this call, especially have had conversations around like waste reduction and thinking the best way to not contaminate recycling is to not buy the product in the first place, right? And I think many of us would probably agree with that approach. But one factor within that is that we live in the United States, right? And we live in a consumer-based culture. So eliminating that is going to, that's going to take a lot of time. Meanwhile, we need to be able to influence product design and actually capture those and recycle those as a kind of a stopgap measure while we're getting towards more waste reduction and elimination. And then your second question having to do about the logic between aluminum being a high energy saving product, but it being ranked less than glass, which was a much less energy saving product. I wasn't part of those negotiations, so I'm not sure. Either Kris or Adrian, do you have any insights into that?
Well, a lot of these things depends on how the energy is created for melting aluminum and so on. So there's a bit of variation in that. What I thought we saw was just one instance. I think it depends on what a life cycle, but in general, there is an environmental case to make sure that things are recycled more. One thing that we realize is that there are sometimes trade-offs. So one of the things is it's clearly made out in the Renew Act that producers have to take care of the environmental impacts of their products from a life cycle perspective. We're also asking them to report on greenhouse gas emissions and also closely follow up on what are the impacts. So it's not just about creating products that are recyclable or reusable and compostable, but also following what are the life cycle impacts of their products that they create. And there are economic incentives to make sure that that happen through what's called the eco-modulation of fees. And just to clarify, having trucks go out to every area, what is proposed is that if you have curbside garbage collection, then you should also be able to have recycling collection curbside.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
And
you.
so we've got just like a minute left on the time. So this will probably be our last question, though there might be some of us that can stay on a little bit later to address other questions or concerns, or can certainly have you reach out to Preston or myself. We had our contact information on the recording as well, but we won't keep you beyond the 3 o'clock. But Kent, go ahead and ask your question.
Just to comment on Adrian's last statement, that if there is garbage service, there should be curbside service. Back in 1990, I worked in the Pierce County market, setting up curbside programs for recycling in Gig Harbor, City of Puyallup, Sumner, was a lot different than setting them up out in Long Branch or up there, past Enumclaw in the, rural areas. You look at the county I live in right now, Okanagan County, that has a population of about 7 to 8 people per square mile, to city of Seattle that has 9,000 people per square mile. There's a big difference whether you can have curbside garbage and recycling. It just doesn't pan out all the way across as the board like a lot of people would like. And if somebody can tell me how I can get glass, to a market that isn't, doesn't create a greater environmental impact. I mean, up here, we're all about reducing versus recycling, just because of the amount of distance between every household and our markets.
Yeah, I think those are fair points so far as it's not a one size fits all model. The good thing about that, Ken, is it would no longer be your problem to solve. It would be the producer's problem to solve, right? The producers would have to figure out how to capture that glass in a way that makes sense for them, because they're not going to want to pay for a huge long transport from Okanagan over to Seattle, right? So they're going to want to reduce their costs and still have to hit their rates.
Yeah, but we also saw with the e-waste program where they would put prices out to bid. Some people were able to negotiate higher prices, and if you weren't one of the first ones in, you got a lower price per, pallet or per pound. And at what point, when they look at rural communities like us and saying, you know what, that price point is just way too expensive for us to pay.
Just following from Preston, the whole idea of this is the funding would be provided. So the cost side, you wouldn't have to care about. Of course, you should be concerned that the environmental impacts don't get worse. One of the stakeholders is the Glass Packaging Institute that represents many of the manufacturers of glass, and they are already considering plans for how it would be possible to collect glass in both an economic and environmental way from eastern and central Washington.
Okay. I know we had another, Henry, please, I don't want to ignore your question, but I do want to respect everybody's time as well. So I think it's good if we go ahead and wrap up so far, because I have another meeting that I have to run to. But please, if you'd like, follow up with the question about how challenging it would be to create consistent statewide markets. Markets is a whole other conversation, so happy to talk to you offline about this. I put my contact info in there, so please follow up because I don't want you to feel ignored, but do want to respect everybody's time. So thank you all for joining us.
It's been a pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, folks.